Welcome back to London's Dark Archives. Today we're going to cover the most famous of the great train robbers, the story of Ronnie Biggs. Ronnie Biggs is the most famous of all the great train robbers. His name is synonymous with daring escapes, life on the run, and an almost mythical status in the world of British crime. But how did he end up as one of the most notorious criminals in the UK? In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into Biggs' early years, his descent into crime, the fateful night that would change his life forever, and his strange life on the run, yet in the spotlight. Ronald Arthur Biggs was born on the 8th of August 1929 in Lambeth, South London. He grew up in Dalziel Road, SW9, close to what is now the O2 Brixton Academy. Like many working class Londoners at the time, childhood was shaped by the turbulent years of World War II. In 1940, with the Blitz devastating London, he was evacuated to Devon and Cornwall, a temporary escape from the dangers of the capital. By 1942, Biggs returned to London, and he attended the Stanley Street School and later the Brixton School, a building where he began training as a carpenter. But stability was never something he could hold on to for long. Tragedy struck in May 1943 when his mother passed away at the age of 53. Whether this event pushed him further into delinquency or merely reinforced his rebellious streak is unclear, but by January 1945, at just 15 years old, he had his first appearance in court. In May 1947, seeking a fresh start, Biggs enlisted in the Royal Air Force, but discipline and authority were not for him, and within 2 years he was dishonourably discharged, bringing his military career to an abrupt end. What followed was a rapid descent into crime. In February 1949, he received his first prison sentence, 6 months for shopbreaking, housebreaking, stealing and using a false ID card. By July the same year, he was sentenced to another 3 years at HMP Wormwood Scrubs, where he met a man who would change the course of his life, Bruce Reynolds. Reynolds, a charismatic and ambitious criminal, took Biggs under his wing, and from that moment on, their paths were intertwined. But their time together behind bars was brief, and upon release, Biggs found himself locked up again, this time in Borstal in November 1949. By the time he was back on the streets, he'd established his connections with some of London's most infamous underworld figures. The 1950s and early 60s see Biggs in and out of prison, becoming more involved with Reynolds and others who would eventually form the core of the Great Train Robbery gang. In 1958, he was sentenced to 2.5 years after being caught breaking and entering with his friend Michael Haynes. Shortly after his release, he married Charmaine Powell, seemingly tried to settle down, but the lure of crime was never far behind. By 1962, Biggs was part of a network of criminals who was eyeing larger targets, including mail trains carrying vast sums of cash. On the 8th of August 1963, his 34th birthday, he played a role, albeit quite a small one, in what would become the biggest heist in British history. On the 16th of April 1964, Ronnie Biggs stood in the dock as Lord Chief Justice Edmund Davies delivered a crushing verdict. Alongside 6 of his accomplices, Biggs received a 30-year prison sentence, one of the heaviest handed down for that crime. Despite the scale, that crime had resulted in no fatalities, and the courtroom, packed with reporters and spectators, buzzed with shock at the severity of the punishment. Biggs was quickly transferred to HMP Wandsworth, one of Britain's most notorious prisons. Built in the 1850s, Wandsworth was a harsh and unforgiving place, its Victorian walls holding some of the country's most dangerous criminals. For Biggs, this was just the beginning of what should have been a 3-decade stretch behind bars. However, from the moment he arrived, he had no intention of serving that time. At Wandsworth, Biggs met Paul Seaborn, a fellow robber. The two men began discussing the possibility of escape, knowing the longer they remained inside, the harder it would be to get out. But a plan required outside help, and Biggs had a key advantage: his wife Charmaine. Unlike many of the other robbers whose family had been left in financial ruin, Charmaine had access to money and contacts on the outside. By mid-1965, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. A plan was forming. July 8th, 1965, Ronnie Biggs was shocked the system, and this is out. 2:45 p.m, the exercise yard. Wandsworth Prison, home to some of Britain's most dangerous criminals, is basking in the summer sun. 14 inmates considered high escape risks are under constant surveillance, including Ronnie Biggs, one of the infamous Great Train Robbers. Despite strict security, Biggs has managed to smuggle in cans of lobster and an illegal radio through which he listens to the Seekers, drawing inspiration from their song lyrics about the Promised Land. 3 p.m. While Biggs contemplates freedom, his wife Charmaine and their 2 children, Nicky and Christopher, are enjoying an outing at Whipsnade Zoo. Little do they know that events set in motion months ago are about to unfold. Charmaine, instrumental in organising the escape, has arranged a daring breakout for her husband and fellow inmate Eric Flower. 3:01 p.m. A green Ford Zephyr and a bright scarlet removal van approach Wandsworth Prison. The van, driven by Paul Seaborn, Biggs' friend recently released from prison, contains an elaborate escape apparatus. Inside, a scaffolding tower is rigged to rise through the roof panel. Armed with shotguns, rope ladders and an axe, the crew is prepared. The entire operation is financed by Charmaine with £10,000. 3:02 p.m. Winifred Williams, wife of a prison warder, notices the van but assumes someone's moving house. However, as she steps outside expecting the baker's van, she sees masked men exiting the vehicles, one brandishing a shotgun. Realising it's a breakout, she retreats inside and bolts her door. 3:03 p.m. Peter Ed, a 17-year-old warder's son working on his motorbike, watches the scene unfold. Seaborn and his men seize him at gunpoint and lock him in his father's shed, ensuring no alarm is raised. To prevent calls to the police, the crew has already disabled nearby phone boxes. 3:04 p.m. Seaborn's team deploys the scaffolding tower, hoisting it against the 25-foot prison wall. The men ascend, armed with rope ladders and weapons. 3:05 p.m. As masked figures appear atop the wall, 4 warders in the exercise yard sound the alarm and rush to intervene. Biggs and Flower, knowing their escape is a distraction, rely on 2 prisoners, Brian and Jock, who launch a staged brawl with the guards. In the confusion, Biggs scrambles up the wall and up the rope ladder. 3:06 p.m. Biggs is the first to reach the summit, greeted by Seaborn. Below, the guards wrestle with the prisoners, creating a diversion. Flowers follows close behind. The prison siren wails as off-duty warders rush from their homes. 3:07 p.m. Biggs and Flower step onto the scaffolding tower and leap into the removal van, landing on mattresses prepared for the landing. Meanwhile, seizing their chance, 2 other prisoners, Robert Anderson and Patrick Doyle, attempt to escape as well, clambering up the ladders. 3:09 p.m. Biggs and Flower sprint to the waiting Ford Zephyr. As the car is about to pull away, Anderson and Doyle knock on the window, pleading for a lift. Biggs shouts, "Let 'em in!" and they squeeze in, making 7 men in a car. The Zephyr speeds away, leaving the van behind. Seaborn had intended to set it ablaze, but he ran out of time. 4 p.m. Charmaine, driving home from Whipsnade Zoo, hears a radio bulletin announcing 4 prisoners have escaped from Wandsworth. She knows her husband is among them. Meanwhile, the escapees have switched vehicles and are en route to a safe house in Dulwich, south east London. 5 p.m. At the Dulwich safe house, Biggs, Flower and Seaborn celebrate the successful escape with champagne. Meanwhile, Wandsworth Prison is swarmed by press and police investigating how such a bold escape could have happened in broad daylight. Detective Chief Superintendent Dick Lewis tells the media it was engineered without a doubt with collusion inside the prison. Midnight. Home Secretary Sir Frank Soskis visits Wandsworth Prison, receiving a humiliating account of the escape from Governor Michael Gove. Though Gove feels repercussions, Soskis later tells Parliament, "I can find no reason to think any blame attaches to the prison service." The next day, the Daily Mail describes the escape as a fantastic operation, which in a few seconds made nonsense of a massive top security precaution. While Biggs and Flower lay low in Dulwich, police respond to every tip-off with full force. The escape has shocked Britain, and authorities are determined to bring fugitives to justice. However, for Ronnie Biggs, this is only the beginning of his life on the run. After his dramatic escape from Wandsworth Prison in July 1965, Ronnie Biggs wasted no time disappearing into the underworld of fugitives. He first fled by sea to Antwerp in Belgium, where he secured false documents to aid his journey. From there, he travelled to Paris, where he underwent extensive plastic surgery in an attempt to alter his appearance. In my opinion, he didn't do too much. The procedure was meant to throw off authorities, but it also symbolised the transformation Biggs would undergo over the years, from a fugitive criminal to an unlikely folk hero. Travelling under false papers, Biggs flew to Sydney on the 29th of December 1965. His wife and young sons later joined him, and the family began a new life in Adelaide, attempting to blend in among the locals. He took on a variety of jobs using different aliases and tried to maintain a low profile. However, life on the run was never simple, constantly looking over his shoulder and wary of any interaction that could expose his true identity. Biggs and his family moved again, this time settling in Melbourne. But Australia, despite its vastness, was not safe enough. In 1969, a tip-off reached Biggs that authorities were closing in. Without hesitation, he made a swift decision to leave everything behind. He boarded a cargo ship from Melbourne to Panama, where he laid low before continuing on to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a country that would become his sanctuary for the next 27 years. In Brazil, Biggs found a land of opportunity and refuge. Rio de Janeiro, with its golden beaches, vibrant nightlife, and relaxed attitude to international fugitives, became his new home. The tropical climate and carefree atmosphere of the city provided Biggs with a freedom he had not experienced since before the Great Train Robbery. However, his notoriety soon caught up with him. In 1974, the British tabloid The Daily Express tracked him down and exposed his whereabouts. The revelation sent shockwaves through the British public, reigniting the government's effort to bring him to justice. British authorities wasted no time lobbying the Brazilian government for his extradition. However, Brazil had no formal extradition treaty with the UK at the time. Even more crucially, Biggs had fathered a son, Michael, with a Brazilian woman. Under Brazilian law, the father of a Brazilian child could not be deported, giving Biggs a legal loophole to remain in the country indefinitely. With that, Biggs's place in Brazil was cemented, and he would remain there for decades, living an unusual and at times extravagant life. Biggs' financial situation was often precarious. The money from the Great Train Robbery had long since run out, and he had to find other ways to sustain himself. Over the years, he became adept at profiting from his own infamy. He sold signed photos, souvenirs, and memorabilia related to the Great Train Robbery. He even opened up his doors to tourists and journalists who was willing to pay for the opportunity to meet the legendary fugitive in person. Visitors would pose for photos, listen to his stories, and pay handsomely for the experience. Beyond that, Biggs made additional money through interviews and media deals. He became somewhat of an attraction in Rio, rubbing shoulders with wealthy businessmen, celebrities and criminals alike. Occasionally, he made public appearances at exclusive parties, charging attendees for the privilege of meeting him. Though he lived modestly, Biggs managed to carve out a life of exile in Brazil, always aware that his continued freedom depended on remaining there. Over time, Biggs' reputation in the UK transformed from that of a fugitive criminal to a sort of anti-establishment folk hero. The tabloids were fascinated by him, regularly featuring updates on his life in Rio. He was portrayed as a cheeky rogue, a man who had beaten the system and lived on his own terms. He still had all the elements of intrigue, an audacious crime, a daring escape, and the life of adventure on the run. As his legend grew, a number of celebrities made the journey to Brazil to visit him. Among his most famous visitors were members of the Sex Pistols, including their manager Malcolm McLaren. In 1978, Biggs recorded a punk rock song called No One Is Innocent with Paul Cook and Steve Jones of the Sex Pistols. The song, featuring Biggs' spoken word contribution, became a counterculture anthem, further cementing his status as an unlikely pop icon. Beyond musicians, actors, journalists, and even minor royalty sought him out. He entertained guests from around the world, his own becoming a strange mix of refuge and spectacle. In the UK, his name remained in the headlines, and despite never setting foot in Britain, he was one of the most famous men in the country. To some, he was a charming outlaw, to others, a criminal who had evaded justice. Either way, he was never forgotten. In 1997, the UK and Brazil finally signed an extradition treaty, rekindling hopes that Biggs could be forced to return to face his sentence. However, Brazil's legal system remained in his favour, and despite numerous attempts, the British government was unable to secure his return. Biggs, though, was no longer the energetic fugitive of his younger years. His health was deteriorating, and by the late 90s he suffered multiple strokes. Life was no longer a game of cat and mouse. He had become frail, struggling to walk or speak properly. By 2001, Biggs realised that his health was failing, and that the freedom he had enjoyed for decades was now overshadowed by his medical needs. In a dramatic and unexpected move, he announced through the Sun newspaper that he was willing to return to Britain voluntarily. He negotiated his return through an exclusive media deal, and on the 7th of May 2001, he arrived in the UK aboard a private jet. As soon as he landed, he was arrested and sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his 30-year sentence. His return was met with mixed reactions. Some felt he'd finally received the justice he'd long avoided, while others saw it as a tragic end to a once glamorous outlaw's life. His health continued to decline in prison, and by 2009 there were growing calls for his compassionate release. On the 6th of August 2009, just a couple of days before his 80th birthday, the government granted his release on medical grounds. He had served around a third of his original sentence. Ronnie Biggs spent his final years in a nursing home, making occasional public appearances when his health allowed. He released an autobiography, Odd Man Out, The Last Straw, and continued to captivate the public's imagination. However, the days of adventure, music and notoriety were over. On the 18th of December 2013, Ronnie Biggs passed away at the age of 84, closing the final chapter on one of Britain's most infamous fugitives. His story remains one of the most remarkable in British criminal history, a tale of crime, escape, survival and reinvention. Whether viewed as a scoundrel or a folk hero, Ronnie Biggs left behind a legacy that continues to fascinate to this day. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating story. I really enjoyed making today's episode, but we've not finished the story of the Great Train Robbery yet, so stick around and the next video will be out soon.